Welcome back to another impactful episode of the PSDA podcast. It is Craig King, your host, your favorite host, your only host, as you know, with your favorite guest. I'm going to pause for about 3 seconds for you to say it. 1, 2, 3. Yep, you're right, Patrick Kelly.
That is not what the listeners just said.
What did they say, Patrick?
I don't know, but it wasn't Patrick Kelly because you said favorite guest.
So, we received an in-person shout-out today. We had shout-out to Lexington School District 2 Teacher Forum.
Absolutely.
They came up for our final, I believe, Hill Day for the session, along with their superintendent, Dr. Hafner. And the current teacher of the year, Ann Reamer, said, before she asked her question, she said, I listened to your podcast, and she reminded us since we last recorded, which kind of made me and Patrick feel bad, but
a
little bit. But she shouted us out, and it felt good to hear someone reference the podcast. So, Patrick, we're famous now.
Absolutely. I mean, we are internet celebrities, podcast celebrities. I don't really know that counts for anything, but it's good to be loved.
Yeah. So we are 13 days.
Let's call it 12 because tomorrow is technically, we're recording this on Wednesday the 10th, so the 11th is technically a day of session, but the Senate's out, the House is out. People may have master tickets. I'm not sure what's going on, but there are 12 days remaining, 4 weeks to go.
Yes, so let's jump right into it. So as you've heard in previous episodes and via the LAN, we knew that the Senate would take a stab at the budget, and so Patrick, let's just jump right there, and then we'll talk about some of those pieces of legislation that we're crossing our fingers for to cross over.
Yeah, so the Senate Finance Committee literally just wrapped up its work just a few minutes before we started recording this. They met for a large portion of the day on Tuesday, and they met for a couple hours on Wednesday. And they have now reported their version of the budget to the full Senate, and they will debate that in 2 weeks. And by and large, the budget that is coming out of the Senate Finance Committee looks a lot like the House version of the budget as it relates to public education, with a couple of significant differences. But the headliner, the one that I know our members are going to be the most interested in, is teacher salary schedule. The Senate Finance Committee adopted the House salary schedule, so that moves that one step closer to finalization. Obviously, the full Senate could amend that on the floor, but if that salary schedule is adopted by the Senate, then it is effectively a done deal, because even in areas where the House and Senate disagree on the budget and have to come to conference committee, they're not rewriting areas where the two chambers were in agreement. So passage of that salary schedule by the full Senate in 2 weeks would effectively lock in that salary schedule. And just as a reminder for people, since it's been about a month since the House went through the budget, that is the salary schedule that maintains 5 lanes, master's plus 30, bachelor's plus 18, and doctorate. It's also the schedule that raises minimum pay, starting minimum pay from $42,500 to $47,000. That is a significant increase, and I think we've said in the past that I think, please don't quote me on this, I should check this at some point since I keep saying it, but I think there's only 2 districts in the state that currently pay their starting teachers beyond $47,000. So that would mean every district except for those 2 in the state would at least have to increase their salary schedule to come into alignment with the new statewide minimum. And this is the salary schedule that extends steps for years of experience from 23 to 28. So no differences to report in salary schedule between the House budget and what has been approved by the Senate Finance Committee.
Well, that's exciting to hear, Patrick. And I really want to take a moment to shout our teachers out, because I remember when the proposal was given by the governor, and it was prior to the Ways and Means having their crack at the budget, and the Ways and Means Committee and the House members heard overwhelmingly from teachers and educators. And so when you hear Patrick say that the Senate voted to keep what the House did, you should give yourself a pat on the back, especially if you were one of the many educators that they heard from. Your advocacy did that. Patrick is great. Our association is great, but we understand the power of advocacy comes from our teachers and the work that you do every day, but also the advocacy that you do every day. So shout out to the teachers.
Yeah, and shout out to the Senate Finance Committee
Yeah.
because they're the ones that received hundreds of emails and phone calls and in-person visits from educators talking about the importance of that salary schedule, and the members of the Finance Committee were unanimous. There was no debate. There was no disagreement on the salary schedule. They adopted it. Now, the one area where they differ from the House that is significant is the House put an additional $230 million for next year into the State Aid to Classrooms program. And that State Aid to Classrooms program is the primary line item that funds school districts in terms of state funding. That $230 million, as proposed by the House, was enough to cover the full cost of the teacher pay increase with some additional money also in there. And State Aid to Classrooms, once salaries are covered, is very flexible. So districts could address needs that could be based on student growth, could be based on inflation. I mean, districts aren't immune to that either. So there was some extra money from the state there in the House budget. The Senate Finance Committee changed the formula for State Aid to Classrooms. And to be more accurate, they reverted to the existing formula because since State Aid to Classrooms was created about 3 years ago, the total size of the pie, the total amount of State Aid to Classroom dollars has been calculated on the basis of a formula that pays teachers on the basis of a model student-teacher ratio of 11.2 to 1. The state is not claiming that teachers have an 11.2 to 1 student-teacher ratio. Right. They're just saying in terms of certified teachers compared to students hired, it's 11.2 to 1. And the average cost of the average teacher and salary and benefits, which they are calculating on the basis of a teacher with 12 years of experience in a master's degree. And that's what they've used to calculate State Aid to Classroom funding for the last 3 years. The House changed that this year. They changed the student-teacher ratio to 11.23 to 1, and they also changed the cost of the average teacher with a number that they selected. It was not a number pulled from the salary schedule. So Senate Finance decided to go back to the formula as it's been for the last 3 years. And as senators articulated it, they said it's a new formula. We shouldn't be changing it at this point in their view. And the net impact of that is about $30 million fewer dollars in State Aid to Classrooms going to districts. And that's significant to districts because there's still, as explained by Senate Finance, there's still enough money in the increase, the roughly $200 million increase to State Aid to Classrooms coming in the Senate Finance version of the budget. That's enough to cover the salary increases, but there's really not a whole lot beyond that, especially for smaller rural districts that because of the way the money gets allocated by formula. So that's a concerning issue. That's a significant issue because obviously the most important factor in student success is the quality of the teacher in the classroom and the quality of the educator. But it's also true that districts have bills. They got to keep the lights on. They got to make sure that the facilities are cared for. They have to provide programming. And so that is going to be an issue between the House and the Senate unless a senator on the floor introduces an amendment to add additional money into State Aid to Classrooms. That could happen in Senate floor debate. But assuming that the Senate Finance Committee version of the budget makes it to the finish line in the Senate, that would be an area where the House and Senate would be in disagreement, and they would have to work out that number in conference committee.
Okay, which we totally expect the budget to go to conference committee. I don't think it has never not gone to conference committee, and so we expect that. But overall, this is a great thing that the Senate Finance agreed with what the House sent over. In large part.
Yeah, and one other area where it differs that has nothing to do really with money, but just as an example of the power of educator voice, is the Senate added 2 provisos around unencumbered time. It doesn't necessarily expend money, but it directs districts. The first one was introduced by Senator Martin out of Spartanburg. Nurses are being worked really from sunup to sundown with no break to take a breath. And so Senator Martin introduced a proviso that directs the State Department of Education to encourage districts where practicable to provide unencumbered time to their school nurses, similar to the 30-minute unencumbered time policy for K-5 teachers and special ed teachers. That proviso got adopted, and then Senator Kevin Johnson followed right behind it and said, well, I've heard from my constituents that are 4K teachers that they're not getting unencumbered time. And he was speaking specifically about public 4K teachers, not necessarily CERDEP private providers. And Senator Johnson talked about how that was frustrating for his constituents that are 4K teachers because they may be working in a classroom literally next door to a kindergarten or first grade teacher who is getting the 30 minutes of unencumbered time. So the Senate adopted that proviso as well. Again, it's encouraging districts to provide it where practicable. But that's a step forward that was driven completely by educator voice. Both Senator Martin and Johnson indicated they were introducing that because they had heard from members, from constituents in their district that were concerned about that issue.
Yeah, when you say that, Patrick, I think about today when Representative Caskey said something to the teachers. He said, "I won't know unless you tell me."
That's right. That was a powerful statement.
It was a powerful statement. I might put it on the T-shirt. And so out there, teachers, you understand the power of your voice, and having that conversation does not mean you're going to agree with everything that your policymaker may propose or agree with, but have the conversation to find common ground and find some wins that you can have together, so they can know how certain policy affects you in the classroom, or there's lack of a certain type of policy. And that is a prime example that Patrick just shared. So I know is today crossover?
Today's crossover. Crossover's done.
Crossover is done. And so let's talk about the pieces of legislation that are important to us that still have a shot, whether it's slim or not.
Sure. Yeah, there's roughly 16 education-related bills that have crossed from the House to the Senate, and 9 that have made it from the Senate to the House. And so all those 25-ish bills are still in play. We've talked a lot about the Educator Assistance Act, H 4280, so I'm not going to recap and rehash that. Obviously, that is a priority for us. We know it's a priority for teachers because we've heard from them, but the ball's in the Senate's court. Another bill that's a top priority for PSTA that's identified in our legislative agenda is S 125, which is sitting in the House. It's a Senate bill. And it would provide educators education majors at state colleges with enhanced lottery scholarship funds. Currently, math and science majors that are Life or Palmetto Fellows get an additional stipend on top of their lottery scholarship as a sophomore, junior, and senior in college. S-125 would simply add education majors to that pool. And we know at PSTA that would be a powerful recruitment tool for teachers because we asked teacher cadets across the state, the future educators, would this make you more likely to major in education? And shockingly, over 80% of them said yes, it would. It would also be a retention tool because if you get an extra roughly $10,000 of scholarship funds during your undergraduate program, that means potentially $10,000 less student debt, which means your monthly student debt payment is lower in your first few years of teaching, which means that salary goes further because you're not having to pay as much on student debt. That's a bill that has passed the Senate multiple times in the past. It's passed the House before. They've just never managed to pass it at the same time in the same session in the same language. We want to see that one get to the finish line this year. That would be a really important bill for recruitment. One other bill in the House that we strongly support is S-305, which is a work experience credit bill that would allow individuals who complete educator certification that are coming to education from a different profession to enter the teaching profession with years of experience on their teaching certificate based on industry-aligned work experience that matches up with their teaching context. So if I've worked at Westinghouse in a chemistry lab for 10 years and I get certified as a chemistry teacher, I can use some of those years. It's a 2-to-1 ratio to not come in at step 0. I could come in at step 5, which obviously would increase my starting pay. So those are bills that we're keeping an eye on. But at this point in the game, it's largely the bills that have crossed from one chamber to the next that are going to be getting attention and have a realistic shot of making it to the finish line.
Yeah, so thanks for those 3 bills, Patrick. And members, as you receive your Legislative Alert Network, Patrick will have reference to those pieces of legislation in the land. So make sure you engage. If you have those personal relationships with members of the Senate and the House of Representatives, depending on where the bill is, leverage those relationships to try to get those bills passed as they're working.
One last thing to mention is that I would just be remiss if I didn't, is today also the House Regulations Committee Subcommittee for Public Education met to receive public comment and to review the State Board of Education's proposed regulation for selection and reconsideration of instructional materials. That's something the State Board was working on as far back as October and November, and our members have been informed about and have asked about. When a regulation is adopted by a administrative body like the State Board of Education, it goes to the General Assembly for approval. So the regulation subcommittee heard public testimony on that today. They reviewed the reg, and as they discussed it, they said they wanted stakeholders to convene to further discuss areas where the regulation could and possibly needs to be improved, and they voted to adjourn debate on the regulation today. So what that means is it's not dead. They didn't vote it down. They simply basically decided not to vote on it today so that further conversation could happen. So that's likely to continue to be a point of conversation throughout the remainder of this session and potentially into the start of next session. A Senate subcommittee also is scheduled for next week that has that regulation on their agenda for a topic of conversation.
Great information, Patrick. Before we close today, anything else you want to share with our teachers coming up? I know the primaries are happening on June 11th, so we want to encourage those teachers and any of your friends and family members that aren't registered to get registered to vote.
That's it. Register to vote. The deadline to register is May the 12th because in South Carolina, you have to register 30 days prior to an election. We are an open primary state, which means that you will be able to select to vote in either the Republican or Democratic primary. It's your choice. You can't vote in both. You got to pick one or the other, but you can't vote in either of them if you're not registered. So prior to May 12th, make sure you're registered. And as we shared with members last week in the LAN, also check your registration status. Never take it for granted that your registration status is current. State Election Commission in South Carolina, I think, does an exceptional job, but they're human like everyone else. Just make sure your registration status is complete. You can easily do that online using the resources we've sent out in the LAN. And if you find out for whatever reason you're not registered, even though you thought you were, you can quickly complete that prior to May 12th.
Yep, good information. So thank you for listening to this podcast episode. Make sure you share it, download it, any action items that we encouraged. This is Craig King, the host of the most famous podcast in the world. Not really. Patrick, you didn't have to laugh.
You could have muted my mic before you said that so that people didn't get me laughing.
Wow,
into
and
the
he's
mic.
the main, most important guest, and he's laughing. Well, anyway.
I don't even think my own mom listens to this podcast, but I appreciate everyone that does.
My mom doesn't either. So anyway, that's not the point. It's been another impactful episode of the PSD podcast. I am Craig King, your host, and also Patrick Kelly's here. Take care. Bye.